Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm Kingshuk Banerjee. I'm part of the firm's dispute resolution practice. We've gathered today, albeit remotely, to discuss some key issues in Indian domestic arbitration. I think undeniably arbitration is the most favored system to resolve commercial disputes today. And though arbitration is commonly referred to as an alternate dispute resolution mechanism, I do believe that this is a misnomer because arbitration is definitely the first port of call when it comes to negotiating a commercial contract. Though arbitration is not new to India, the practice, the procedures, and the laws around arbitration are constantly evolving. In the past 5 years, we've had two major amendments in the Arbitration Act. We've also had the Supreme Court and various high courts pass several judgments on various issues. And while all of this is very well intended, what we find is, and this is feedback coming from users of the arbitration process, feedback coming from clients and litigants, that there remains confusion around some of these issues. So what we'll try and do in this webinar, and what we've done is based on our experiences, and we can move to the next slide. So what we've done is based on our experiences and questions that we received from our clients, over the years, we've put together a few topics that we propose to discuss today. We will follow a Q&A format. You have the broad topics on your screen. We will have a Q&A format with questions on each of these topics for our expert panelists, who I will shortly introduce. Each of these topics, to be honest, warrant a detailed discussion and perhaps even a webinar of its own, but we only have 45 minutes to an hour, so we'll try and complete the discussion within 45 minutes. And what we propose to do after that is open up the webinar for questions from the audience. If for time constraints we are unable to take your questions, please do use the facility provided in the webinar to put in your question, and we will try and respond to you offline. Also, a recording of this webinar will be shared with you post the panel discussion. So we have a very distinguished panel today. Firstly, Gaurav Joshi and Zal Andhiyaru Jeena, both very senior lawyers, designated senior advocates. They regularly appear in various courts and tribunals in India, including the Supreme Court of India, the Bombay High Court, and the National Company Law Tribunal. Gaurav and Zal also routinely appear in arbitrations. They act as arbitrators as well in some cases. And also, they are very regular. I mean, you can see them in the Bombay High Court frequently. They are there all the time when it comes to arbitration-related cases. I think nothing I say will really justify their experience and expertise in the field. So we eagerly look forward to your practical insights on arbitration, Gaurav and Zal. We are also delighted to have Dr. Sanjeev Khemawat. He's a corporate lawyer and, if I may say so, a friend of the firm. He has almost 3 decades of experience spanning varied industries. He's presently working as Executive Director, Legal and Group Company Secretary with Dalmia Bharat Group. Dr. Khemawat also has substantial experience in arbitration, and he's kind enough, he's been kind enough to agree to provide us with the industry perspective when it comes to domestic arbitration. Last but not the least, we have Raj Panchmatia, my partner at Khaitan and Company, also a part of the firm's dispute resolution practice. Raj has tremendous experience in the field of arbitration, both at the domestic as well as at the international fora. He's advised clients on a wide variety of claims under the Indian arbitration laws, as well as institutional rules outside of India like SEAC, LCIA, ICC. And incidentally, Raj is also on the SEAC panel of arbitrators, so very well suited for this discussion today. I think without wasting any more time, we'll dive straight into the discussion. Tejas, we can remove the presentation. It'll be easier, I think, for everybody. So what we'll do is we'll start with, you saw the topics on your screen. So what we'll try and do is we'll start with arbitration agreement as a topic. We have a brief discussion around it. Arbitration is a creature of contract, as we all know it. The process starts with the arbitration agreement. And how often have we seen a carelessly drafted arbitration clause prolonging legal proceedings? So what I will request Dr. Ghemawat to first share his thoughts on the importance of an arbitration clause in the context of commercial contracts. So Dr. Ghemawat, if you can have your views to open this discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Kangshuk. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me to share my views. Now, as you rightly pointed out, carelessly drafted arbitration clauses. And this is what the difficulty as far as the Indian domestic arbitration scene is concerned. Now, as we all know, all commercial contracts, they are of varied nature. Some complex contracts, some simple contracts. So it depends on the nature of industry. It depends on the size of the contract, or the monetary value, or the term of the contract, and the issues, or the what kind of contract it is, shareholders agreement or vendors contract, or the varied kinds of contracts. Now, the dispute resolution clause, it depends what kind of contract we are entering into. So obviously, there's no state jacket formula that what kind of arbitration clause you would be following for a particular kind of contract. There would, it depends from contract to contract. But then when we talk about the alternative dispute resolution mechanism or arbitration, obviously the objective which is there in our mind is that we can save cost, we can save time, and also that our agreement should not be subject to multiple interpretations, so that we can always avoid delays and all that. But last 3 decades of experience nearly suggests that arbitration clauses has always been a 4 a.m. clauses. These are the clauses have always been a pathological clauses. And just to give you some examples, in a long-term contract of 10 years, if we have a named arbitrator, I would say certainly pathological contracts, clauses. If there are even number of arbitrators, yes, there is a problem. These are pathological clauses. In a small value contract, if you have a panel of 3 arbitrators, obviously you will not be meeting your objectives of time and cost. If you are not clear in your arbitration clause that which all issues you would be referring to arbitration, then they are certainly pathological clauses. If you are mentioning the institution in your arbitration clause while no specific mention of which institution you are referring to, then these are pathological clauses. But then believe me, the reality is that the courts are flooded with these kind of arbitration clauses, and that is the reason we at times blame courts for their interference and in terms of these proceedings. But the reality is that there are pathological clauses in the market, and even not only the clients or the organizations which they use these clauses, but also law firms, I have noticed at times they also use pathological clauses. So what are the do's which we should be doing while drafting the contract? And obviously we need to spend some time and efforts in terms of drafting it. And particularly if I want to focus on this, I would say that yes, we need to be very clear that what kind of contract we are entering into. Depending upon that, whether that should be an ad hoc arbitration or institutional arbitration, or what kind of arbitral tribunal we are looking for, sole arbitrator or a panel of 3 arbitrators, what kind of seat we are looking for in terms of the procedural law, in terms of the which court would be supervising the arbitration, or what would be the nationality of the award. And similarly, venue is also important. But then above all, I would also say, because of the court's innovations and interpretations of the on the arbitration law, we need to be very well updated as far as laws are concerned. So there are 2 things. One is, if the institutions are not existing and if the parties are referring to those institutions, I think that needs to be stopped, and parties should be aware about this. For example, just to give you an example, LCIA in India chapter, they have stopped functioning in India. But then I have noticed when they stopped their shop, after 2 years also, I noticed that there were agreements flooded in the market with LCIA India office. Similarly, for example, like traditionally we have those leasing arrangements, and in the leasing arrangement, I work with the real estate industry, and so I can say so that the lease contracts, we used to have arbitration clauses. But then one fine morning, when that Himangini Enterprises judgment came, then that says that no, in a lease contracts you cannot have an arbitration clause. Now you need to be updated with this thing. For example, Perkins. Now all contracts, all government contracts, or even all those standard form of contracts, there one party has a right to appoint arbitrator. Now, in Perkins, judgment says that no, you cannot appoint a sole, one party cannot appoint a sole arbitrator. So I think the updation of law is also important while drafting the contract. So this is what my preliminary comments as far as the drafting is concerned. I think that one should be giving enough time, depending upon the nature of contract, depending upon the legal issues, revolving around that, and then draft the commercial contract or draft the arbitration. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ghemawat. I think you've set the context for our discussion and expressed your concerns very clearly. What I will request is, Raj, perhaps you can share with us, your views on what the arbitration clause should ideally cover. What are the key essential features that must form part of the arbitration clause, really to address concerns as raised by Dr. Ghemawat?
Thank you, Kinshuk. I think I must thank Mr. Ghemawat for making my life easy. He's kind of covered everything that I had to say. In that sense, I'm happy that he's covered all the points. But as we see in the law firms, and we've seen many times that the kind of drafts that come to us, sometimes there are advisories that comes to us on the drafting of the arbitration clauses, and we kind of see there are sometimes serious issues on the clauses, and therefore we have to advise everybody, including clients, to say that when you are drafting an arbitration clause, give a little more attention to your arbitration clause, because at the end of the day, if you get into a dispute, you don't want a situation that where you are first fighting a dispute only on the arbitration clause, whether it is rightly worded, wrongly worded, whether the appointments are correct or not. So be careful about having your arbitration clause correctly drafted. It is very, very important to see that, one, whether you are entering into a domestic agreement or you are entering into a cross-border agreement. Your arbitration clause will also depend on that, because if you are doing a cross-border agreement, and if you have to enter into arbitration agreement where there is a cross-border parties involved, and if you're looking at sitting in arbitration outside of India, then you need to look at different criteria and parameters as well, other than what you look for in the domestic arbitration criteria. You'll also have to look at the reciprocating country and the enforcement mechanism. But while you're looking only for the domestic arbitrations, where there are two domestic parties who are entering into an agreement, we need to also be careful about certain issues. As we've seen in the past, arbitration clauses are by and large treated as a midnight clause, or as Mr. Ghemawat said, it's a champagne clause, which will come last. Nobody puts enough attention to an arbitration clause while drafting it. And it's only when the disputes start that everybody starts looking at the arbitration clause to see whether it was correctly drafted or not. Some of the key issues that we see and we highlight is that at the time of drafting, be clear whether you want an institutional arbitration or an ad hoc arbitration. Both are equally suitable depending on the nature of the contract. If your contracts are smaller in size, if the value of disputes are smaller, you may want to consider an ad hoc arbitration. But if your disputes are reasonably large size, you may want to go in for an institutional arbitration, unless an institution provides for a small claim dispute mechanism, which gives you an arbitration clause for smaller claims as well. So that's very important. Second, you also need to clarify where your seat of arbitration will be, because that's an important requirement, the fulcrum of your arbitration, because the seat of arbitration is more critical. Gaurav will give us a greater insight into it little later in this session. I would say keep the language of your arbitration clause simple. Don't make it very complicated. Otherwise, you leave time in interpreting your contracts itself, in the arbitration clauses itself. You need to also keep in mind what are the disputes that you want to cover through the arbitration clauses. There could be sometimes some exclusions that you may want in an arbitration, certain disputes which you don't want to cover in an arbitration, and may just be wanting to cover certain parts in arbitration. Sometimes there are issues when there are multi-parties involved in a contract. There are multiple parties in a contract. How do you then ensure that you have arbitration clause is well drafted to ensure that if there are parties, only two parties to a dispute going for arbitration and not all parties going. So you need to be also very clear about the language for that. Again, please mention, if you're taking an institutional arbitration, I would suggest that please mention which institution and rules of the institution, because otherwise it can create a lot of complications, as Mr. Gemawat also pointed out. Number of arbitrators, the language of the arbitration. I think some of these are very simple but important points which cannot be overlooked. And if you take these basic requirements, I think we should have a reasonably decent arbitration clause in place. If you are using an institutional arbitration, I would recommend that consider the model clauses which the institutions provide, because those are tried and tested, applied, and it can be easily applied, of course, with suitable tweaks. Thank you.
Thanks, Raj. I think the key takeaway seems to be that don't treat this as a midnight clause. Don't treat it as a 4 a.m. clause. Fence on the clause also. That seems to be the key takeaway. But I think, Raj, both you and Dr. Gemawat mentioned the importance of identifying the seat. And my question to Gaurav is really around the law that exists today insofar as the seat is concerned, especially in domestic arbitration. Concept has evolved since Balco, and we've had the most recent judgment of Justice Nariman in SOMA, BGS SOMA. So what really, Gaurav, is the implication of designation of a seat in a domestic arbitration clause? That's my question for you, Gaurav, because there seems to be a lot of confusion around seat and venue and place of arbitration.
So thank you, Kimsuk. Taking it forward from what Raj said, seat of arbitration is ultimately held to be the center of gravity of the arbitration clause. Now, the law as it has evolved, and I'll say it has evolved because there have been various judgments, including of Supreme Courts, which have taken different views. But the law as it now finally settled post-Balco, particularly in BGS, SGS, is that the seat of arbitration grants is akin to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. So if you agree, and I take a domestic arbitration first, if you agree to the seat of arbitration being, say, Mumbai, it is like granting exclusive jurisdiction to courts in Mumbai to decide matters relating to the arbitral procedure and challenges the Curial law. Curial law, of course, would be Indian law, but the challenges to the arbitration and the award which would be passed, etc., would be decided exclusively in Mumbai. Interim applications also would probably be decided exclusively in Mumbai because it's akin to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. Going further, as far as international disputes are concerned, there are certain other angles to it also. In international arbitration, apart from being an exclusive jurisdiction clause, it also decides the law relating to the conduct of the arbitration and the Curial law. So it's also, in a sense, a choice of law clause insofar as law other than the law of the contract. Of course, the law of the contract can be any law. It could be Indian law, could be English law, could be. But the law of the arbitration agreement, the courts in which you would be challenging it, the procedure which the courts would follow, would all depend upon the seat of arbitration because it's akin to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. So whether it's a domestic arbitration or it's an international arbitration, I believe that a lot of importance and thought should be given to selection of the seat of arbitration, and parties should, at the time when they are drafting the contracts, decide which courts they want to grant exclusive jurisdiction to while selecting the seat of arbitration. It should not be that later on you decide that, oh God, I agreed to a seat of arbitration in England, but it's too expensive to go to England. I don't want to go to England. I want to challenge everything in India, and I want to take out proceedings in India. You should have then applied your mind at the outset to that. Because it's people very often mechanically tend to enter into agreements, tend to accept, tend to not to look in advance and think ahead and see whether there will be disputes and what would be the impact of such disputes and how those disputes would be resolved. So they do not often concentrate on this question of seat of arbitration or place of arbitration, but they accept something which is there in a standard contract. In fact, taking it further, in most of the contracts, you find that the seat of arbitration is not selected, and that has to be inferred from the circumstances. What parties do is they select the venue of arbitration, but venue is not akin to seat. Venue can amount to seat in a given set of circumstances and may be a strong indicator of what the seat of arbitration is. But you can always specifically specify a seat, and then it's left to the arbitrators to sit wherever it is convenient. That would probably be the venue of the arbitration. So people, when you draft an arbitration agreement or you draft a clause in an arbitration agreement, please note the difference between venue and seat, and please concentrate on that. Do not take it for granted that the venue is necessarily the seat. It, in most cases, may be interpreted to be seat, and there are differing judgments of the Supreme Court on that issue. But it's not necessarily it is the seat. So the place of arbitration, which is normally the seat of arbitration, and the word seat, as you know, does not find place in the Arbitration Act. It is judge-evolved law. The Arbitration Act deals with place and venue. Place is analogous. In some judgments, it's been held to be analogous to seat, but not necessarily may not be seat. So seat is judge-evolved law, and you should be very careful, and particularly in view of the latest judgments of the Supreme Court, you should apply your mind to what court you would like to approach in case of disputes. Of course, you're going to go to arbitration, but in relation to the arbitral proceedings, which court would you be approaching? And whilst applying your mind to that, you should select the seat of arbitration. Ultimately, it's a fulcrum of the arbitration agreement, and probably the most important selection, which parties often do not make at the time when they enter into the agreement.
So thanks, Gaurav. I think thank you very much for the detailed comment around seat. But you did mention that this is judge-evolved law, and it's judge-made law. Really, what you're saying is that, look, there is no express provision in the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, and perhaps that is one reason why there is a fair bit of confusion around it. So would you agree that it would make sense to have some express provision in the Act to address once and for all?
I think I would agree with you, because if you see the judgment of the Supreme Court in BGS SGS, Justice Nariman has actually interpreted the judgment in Balco. Now, on a given interpretation in Balco, particularly for domestic arbitrations, it could be argued that two courts had jurisdiction. The ones where the seat was there, or the one where the cause of action arose. There was some confusion on interpretation of the various paragraphs of Balco, which has now been clarified by Justice Nariman in BGS SGS, where he has said, no, seat is akin to exclusive jurisdiction, following various other judgments of the Supreme Court, like Reliance, and which ultimately follows the English judgment in Roger Shashua's case. But the clarity, and often judges take different views. Ultimately, there are contracts which even a selection of seat may not be exclusive jurisdiction if you have a clause which relates to exclusive jurisdiction. So you can specifically provide that seat will be X, but by agreement, the exclusive jurisdiction will vest in Y. So all those are circumstances which have to be taken into account, and the law keeps on developing depending upon the facts and circumstances of this case. But if there's a legislative amendment which puts a finality to it, if a legislative amendment is there which uses the word seat as against place which is used, and which specifies exactly what is the impact of selecting a seat of arbitration and what are the consequences thereof, then once a statute is clear, the parties are always aware, and they do not have to look into various judgments or go to lawyers to understand and interpret the law. If the law is clearly spelled out by way of a legislative amendment, then in future the disputes are avoided, and even judges would then be guided by the legislative amendment. But it requires some discussion, because then the legislature would probably have to consider various, ultimately the parties are free to select what law is applicable, which courts are ultimately in an arbitration agreement, which courts you have to approve. So legislature would have to consider the vast scenario of circumstances and cases which may arise, and then come to a conclusive finding, and not finding, but a conclusive enactment setting out the exact impact of seat. But it would clarify a lot of matters and probably reduce the amount of litigation.
Thank you, Gaurav. So from seat, I think the next important aspect is appointment of arbitrators, constitution of the arbitral tribunal itself. And often, again, from experience, what we find is it can sometimes be a challenge. We've had amendments in the Arbitration Act setting out timelines in completion of an arbitration, but sometimes the appointment or constitution of the tribunal itself can be a prolonged affair. Zal, if I can request you to just probably come in and share your thoughts on what measures can parties adopt? Are there any best practices to try and expedite appointment of an arbitrator, expedite the formation of an arbitral tribunal? Because this is something, it's a genuine concern that clients seem to have, litigants seem to have. Zal.
Sure, Kingshuk. Kingshuk, first of all, let me thank you for your very flattering, if not entirely true, introduction. Let me
It's all true,
also
sir.
thank.
It's all true.
Anyway, thank you for that. Let me thank my colleague Gaurav for also being here. Raj, my friend of many years, and let me also say that I'm very happy to be sharing this platform with Dr. Ghimawat. Having said that, I've listened with interest to some of the other questions you've already asked. And it seems to me that there is a common thread which has run through some of those answers and what I would like to say with regard to appointment as well. I think the most casual observer of arbitration in India would agree that there are two principal problems and they are in one sense running hand in hand. The first, and it is really the search for the holy grail as far as Indian arbitration is concerned, is the search for clarity in the law. That has been, with the greatest of respect to the judges who have dealt with the Arbitration Act and with those who have sought to bring about amendments, been elusive. I think we see that in the context of appointment of arbitrators as well. And of course, where there is no clarity, there is always confusion, and confusion results in a delay. So I think that one of the principal problems that we have, both in terms of the eventual fruits of arbitration, as well as starting the process, is a problem of confusion. Now, in that sense, having said that, I think if you were to pick up the bare act of the Arbitration Act as it stands amended today, it would be very confusing for anyone if they were to look at Section 11. I did, before this talk, for the purpose of appraising myself about what was the position with regard to appointment. And of course, the staggering thing is that Section 11 only speaks about appointment by institutions, and as amended by the 2019 Act. And of course, you have to then do a deep dive into the law on appointment to find that these amendments have not been notified yet. So it's very confusing because you open the bare act, which I have here with me. I brought it along to show you people. This is the 2020 version of the bare act, and it has the 2019 amendment in section 11. Of course, it omits to notice the fact that the 2019 amendment, as far as bringing in the institutions into section 11, has not been brought into force. So the casual student of arbitration could be forgiven for saying that, hang on, the role of the court is altogether eliminated. We have to go to the institutions. But then, of course, you don't, because this has not been brought into effect. So that's an illustration of one of the problems that has bedeviled arbitration in India. I think it's fair to say that it is a problem right from the time that the law is written to the time that the law is brought into practice by us lawyers. It's sought to be settled by the judges. It's sought to be dealt with by the arbitrators. Now, having said that sort of generalized comment, let's talk about Section 11 in more particularly for the time that I have left. I mustn't exceed my timelines. Well, the first point I think that would expedite matters is actually to notify the amendments brought about by the 2019 amendments. Effectively, for the audience who may not have a very particular sort of knowledge of the new Section 11, it seeks to set the entire practice of appointing of arbitrators in the province of certain accredited institutions. So it takes it away from our very overburdened courts and it plants it in the capable hands of specialist institutions who will do this exercise of appointment. I, for one, think it's a salutary move if that were to be done. The institutions, of course, would have to be carefully accredited, and we would have to ensure that they are the right persons who man those institutions. But I think it would expedite the process of appointment to start with. Point number one. So that is actually what is to be brought into effect in the Act and what is not there today. What is there today is also a salutary development, namely under the 2015 amendment, they brought about 6A, which effectively says that the court, while deciding to appoint an arbitrator, will merely examine whether there is an arbitration clause or not. So it has eliminated a great deal of controversy that used to arise normally at the Section 11 stage with regard to arbitrability of the dispute, so on and so forth. So there have been some legislative moves which I think have helped. I think that the legislature and the executive should be more proactive in bringing about the 2019 amendment. I think that will help also a great deal. As it were, backing up a little bit, many of the things that all of my co-panelists have spoken of now, of course, will help. We must have a clear clause. We must be clear on the number of arbitrators. We must have clarity on seat. We must have clarity on venue. We must have clarity on subject matter of the arbitration. It's, I think, axiomatic that the clearer we are, there is less space for confusion and there is less space for delay. So in what I would say is that the process is improving. There was a time when the courts took over 6 months to hear Section 11 applications. I think even the courts have become conscious of the fact that that was a failing on their part. Judges such as Justice Kulkarni have had devised a system that the Section 11 would come up the next day before them. They dealt with it in a fairly disciplined manner. They looked for only one thing, the existence of the arbitration clause. I think that the 6A is a useful amendment, and I think that if we notify the 2019 amendment, I think the process of appointment will be even faster.
Right. No, I think absolutely right. That seems to be the need for the hour. But just staying on with arbitrators and appointment of arbitrators, what also we find in several cases, and I'll request Raj and Dr. Khemawat to come in, that in many cases we find that parties may have consented to the appointment of an arbitrator, but post such appointment, post the constitution of the tribunal, they develop a suspicion as to the impartiality or independence of the arbitrator during the course of the arbitration. And there is a fair bit of confusion around what measures, what remedies does a party have in these circumstances. Raj, I know you've dealt with some of these situations, so perhaps you can throw some light on this, and then we can take inputs from Dr. Khemawat also based on his personal experiences. Raj?
Sure. Yeah. So the whole issue regarding the challenge of an arbitrator revolves between Section 12 to 15 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, there are multiple issues that you need to take care of while looking at challenging an arbitrator, and which would amount, what are the grounds which would amount to say that this arbitrator has to be removed. Now, one, whether the arbitrator should be removed or will he recuse himself if certain issues are brought before him, that would fall within the provisions of 12 and 13. And what are the provisions which would take you to 14, which is that you go to court for a removal of an arbitrator? Because there has always been a confusion as to which issues should be taken before the tribunal, which issues should be taken before the court. I think the judgment of Bharat Broadband, which came in 2019, has kind of clarified a lot of these issues. Justice Nariman has given a very nice judgment on this issue. And in fact, it says that if there is a justifiable doubt as to its as to the independent and impartiality of an arbitrator, that application will have to be moved before the arbitrator itself, because it is a fact-finding situation whether there is an impartiality, whether there is an independence issue or not. So those issues will have to be brought before the arbitrator itself, and the arbitrator will adjudicate upon it. It is possible that the arbitrator may say no, he is independent and he is impartial, so he has rejected your challenge. The only remedy available to you then would be to take it in 34 at the time of challenging the awards. Whereas if there is an issue regarding de jure, if an arbitrator has become de jure or de facto incapable of continuing his duties as an arbitrator, then yes, under Section 14 you can make an application, because there under 12 or 13 the tribunal then can't rule on its jurisdiction, because it becomes impossible for him to continue in that position. And Bharat Broadband very clearly says that in such a situation, you go to the court and make an application to the court for removal of an arbitrator. Of course, it is very important that at any point in time, if an arbitrator appointed by parties, he himself feels that there is a chance of that he needs to disclose certain additional facts about his connection with a party or a council, it is important to do that immediately. And as soon as the parties get to know, within 15 days, they ought to approach and make that application before the tribunal. Of course, there are certain times when you will also see there are procedures agreed for removal of an arbitrator, or a challenge procedures within the agreements itself. Within the arbitration agreements, the parties may have agreed on a challenge procedure, then follow those procedures. The even Act recognizes that part. But I think Bharat Broadband is kind of giving a good clarity on the entire challenge process, and to read with section 12 to 15 to that effect, which kind of lays down the entire process quite well.
Right. So challenge before the arbitrator. If the arbitrator rules against you, you still have the ability to challenge the award on that ground under 34. So that's really the takeaway from that. Dr. Ghemawat, have you, from a client's perspective, have you come across this kind of a situation? If so, how did you deal with it? Very briefly, Dr. Ghemawat, if you can also throw light on this.
Well, very briefly, Kingshuk, on this. I would say that it's all for academic discussions, and it's of very little and no practical significance. And why I say so, let me give you an example. Section 12 is very clear. It says there should be some circumstances which should exist, which gives rise to the doubts about impartiality or independence. Now, what are those circumstances? Those circumstances are normally not in writing. These are verbal. This is based on behavior and conduct of the arbitrators. So how arbitrators behave in conduct? They would be imposing cost on you, while they would be saying that your own lawyer has suggested this and advised it, and they would write that in the order. And a lawyer cannot say anything because this is the kind of relationship and which exists on the on that platform, or putting pressure on the other party. You file this application or that application, etc. So you determine this, that this person is not independent, it's not impartial based on his conduct and behavior, and this is largely verbal. If he is passing some orders, then he would be basing this as the advice of the council. Now, in a situation like this, there's a catch-22 situation, and catch-22 situation is there's complete lack of evidence. If you want to file an application for that, then that would be going to the same arbitral tribunal. Now, tell me, which arbitrator would be saying that no, I was not independent or I was partial? Which arbitrator would say? So ultimately, you have no option but to go for section 34. Now, in a situation like this, and in section 34 also, when you have a high-powered arbitrators, retired judges, etc., which court normally would say that no, this person was impartial or not independent. Now, it's this kind of situation, a catch-22 situation, and I think largely you come across these kind of incidents and experiences. And you ask me my practical experience, I tell you, Kingshuk, if I advise my lawyer that let us file this application, my lawyer and my senior advocate would be saying, okay, if you want to file it, we are not with you. You please, arrange arguments with some other counsel. Now, this is what the situation is, and that is the reason why I say this is very little or no significance. These provisions are there, but then they are for academic discussions, because no lawyer would be contesting your case in a situation like this. Thanks.
So if I may just come in, Kingshuk, for a minute here. So when
Dr. Ghemawat, Raj is definitely going to act for you, not to worry.
Yeah, I know.
So we have to be very mindful, because as I was saying, that these applications can have a very drastic impact on your arbitration itself. So unless you have sufficient evidence to show that the arbitrator has acted in a partial manner, it's very difficult to fly these allegations, and it's very important that you have a substantial evidence to show that the arbitrator is partial in a particular manner, or yes, he's biased in a particular manner. So before making these applications, you have to be very certain. Otherwise, it can backfire on the parties very bad.
Completely agree, Raj. I think that is what the predicament is. That you can't have those evidences. You know the circumstances, or based on those conduct and behavior, but then you don't have a solid evidence to that effect. And that's the reason why there is a limitation attached to this. And you're very right, because it would fall flat on your face if suppose you have a uncooked kind of application on this. I completely agree.
Right. So we'll move to another very common feature of legal proceedings per se and arbitration, interim applications and interim reliefs. I think prior to 2015, it was routine for parties to file interim applications before courts, even after constitution of the arbitral tribunal. It was par for the course. Section 9 applications could potentially be filed after constitution of the arbitral tribunal. But Gaurav, this has changed post 2015, and maybe you can throw some light on why there's been that change, and really post 2015 today, the teeth to Section 17 orders, that is orders applications before the tribunal, they have been enhanced. Today, a Section 17 order is as effective as a order by courts. So in your experience, is it still possible to apply before courts after constitution of the arbitral tribunal? If so, what would be these circumstances?
Thank you. Let me give an illustration of a matter which I'd appeared in. Though it was pre-amendment, but it would be quite apt. What happened was, there in the matter, the claimant had obtained some monies under interim orders from the tribunal against furnishing a bank guarantee, which the claimant was liable to keep alive during the pendency of the arbitral proceedings. What happened was, the bank at some stage refused to extend the bank guarantee. So claimant at that stage decided to apply to the arbitrators under Section 17, and this was pre-amendment. And I think the same law would probably apply post-amendment, because sought to apply to the arbitrators that direct the bank to extend the bank guarantee. The bank was not a party to the arbitral proceedings. Bank refused to appear. When we, for the respondents, try to point out to the arbitrators that you can't pass orders against third parties, the arbitrators say, how are you prejudiced? If you get a bank guarantee, you should be happy. So please do not argue. So arbitrators went ahead and passed orders against the bank, directing it to renew the bank guarantee. The bank, of course, once the order was passed, went in appeal. And in the proceedings in the High Court, the judge commented, and it was a very apt comment. He said, in a match between India and Pakistan, New Zealand is declared the loser. So the bank lost, and bank was not heard, and the orders were passed against the bank. So these are some illustrations. So if you want orders against third parties, these are circumstances where it's not possible for the arbitrators to pass orders against third parties or bind parties who are not before it. In such circumstances, subject to whatever limitations there are under Section 9, you can always approach a court. And amendment provisions also say that if circumstances exist, that the remedy is not efficacious. So if you want orders against third parties, they may be orders which affect the rights of third parties. They may be orders which do not affect the rights of third parties. Right? Third parties may not be affected, but they're still bound to comply with such orders. Then it is better to approach the court and obtain orders against such third parties. Third parties otherwise may not respect orders of the arbitrator and will claim they're not bound by it. So it will be very difficult to enforce orders even post-amendment of the arbitrator against third parties, whilst pre-amendment, whilst under Section 9, once it's an order of the court, it can be enforced against anyone. So that is one illustration of a circumstance. Of course, we are aware that the law is that under Section 9, you can even file proceedings against third parties or not parties to the arbitral arbitration agreement, provided they're claiming through or under. So you have such circumstances where you, even though an arbitral tribunal is constituted under Section 17, you still approach the court. Then you may also want a court receiver to be appointed. But the law is that the arbitrators have no power to appoint the court receiver. They may appoint a private receiver. But often private receivers do not receive police assistance. Private receivers do not get cooperation of the parties. It's sometimes difficult for private receivers to enforce orders of the arbitral tribunal. So a court receiver, of course, moment a court receiver gets, the police generally are bound to comply with his request. You may want a court receiver. Then again, it's a case where you have to make out a case under Section 9 that a private receiver will not be sufficient. I want a court receiver, and therefore the circumstances are such that the remedy under Section 17 will not be efficacious. Another point which I can think of is that it's not possible. You want very urgent reliefs, and it may not be possible for the arbitral tribunal to meet or to constitute itself. One of the arbitrators may not be well. Some of the arbitrators may be traveling. Of course, now today with video conferencing, it's possible to even have a hearing on video conferencing. But there are various circumstances where it may take time, or the arbitrators may be very busy and they may not have the time slot to give you an immediate hearing. In such circumstances, if the arbitrators indicate that they can't do it, of course, you can move the court under Section 9 and get urgent relief. So these are certain circumstances which you can move. Of course, the law has changed significantly after the amendment. Earlier, it was in dispute as to whether you could even enforce orders of the arbitral tribunal, but you can, in what manner would you enforce? Whether it would amend the contempt, not contempt, whether a party who refuses to comply would be held guilty of contempt, and how would you approach the court? Now, of course, the Section 17 has made it very explicit that the orders under Section 17 can be enforced as orders of court. So that has, to a large extent, cured the defect which was there in the Act, if I may say so, regarding enforceability of arbitrators' orders. And of course, now section, in view of that, Section 17 has also been expanded. Various powers have been expressly given, which were earlier probably, it was debatable whether the arbitrator had such powers, which were powers available under Section 9. So arbitrator can pass order, and Section 9 itself has been amended, which says that if the arbitral tribunal is constituted, you can't approach the court unless you can make out circumstances which exist where the remedy of approaching the arbitral tribunal is not efficacious. So to a large extent, the amendment has limited your choice to approach the court once the tribunal is constituted, but it's not an absolute bar, and there will be circumstances. I gave a few illustrations. There could be many other circumstances in which you may be constrained to approach the court.
Right. So I think moving from some of the substantive aspects to the procedural aspects, and I think one key change that was brought about in the Arbitration Act in 2015, and again quickly changed in 2019, was with respect to timelines. Arbitrations were to be completed now within a specified time period. It was 12 months in 2015 across the board from the date of appointment of the tribunal, but that quickly was changed in 2019 and made applicable only to domestic arbitrations, and that too the 12-month period kicked in from the date of completion of pleadings. Azad, what has been your experience insofar as timelines are concerned? Have you found has this worked in your experience, and really was this change in 2019 necessary at all?
Right. So Kingshuk, just for our audience, I'd just like them to know what exactly the timeline is first, before giving you my view on it. You touched upon it.
Yes, please.
But in 2015, the amendment stated that the arbitrator would have a period of 1 year from the time that he received the letter of his appointment. There would be a discretionary 6-month extension if both parties agreed, after which, for a further extension, one of the parties would have to apply to the court. The 2015 amendment then provided that the court would grant the extension if there was sufficient cause to do so. So that was the situation in 2015. Just in the context of the intervening years, I think that the period was viewed as too short. The Indian arbitration system was not geared to deliver an award within such a short period of time. And once again, I say that is a failing on the part of the lawyers, on the part of the arbitrators all around, partly because we don't have a dedicated bar. And therefore, one of the great reasons for delay in arbitration is the convenience of counsel also who participate. I am generally to blame for such delays, so on and so forth. So I think that the general perception was that it was just too difficult to actually complete it with the clock starting from that time. So I do believe that the 2019 amendment, which reset the starting point to the completion of pleadings, is more realistic in that sense. Things otherwise remain the same, but they reset the clock to the starting of the pleadings. They also pulled out international commercial arbitrations from this discipline, in the sense that they said that this doesn't apply to international commercial arbitration, which you once again touched upon, Kingshuk. And they said reasonably we expect them to finish roughly along these timelines as well. Now, my experience has been an experience in the intervening years from 2015 to 2019, where I think in the short period of time, I'll be content with what I said. I think that it was a great strain on everyone to finish it within a year. My experience was that it was difficult to finish it within a year. The arbitrators therefore devised somewhat ingenious system that in procedural order 1, they would record straight away the party's consent to consent the additional 6 months. So straight from 1 year, you went to 1 year, 6 months. And during the course of the arbitration, it was more or less sort of made clear by the arbitrator that, look, you're not going to get any accommodation if I don't get it at the time of making the award. So there was a sort of general consensus that, yes, of course, we'll go to court and we'll have to make out a cause and we'll have to get an extension. So that was a practical solution to what was an unrealistic timeline. Now with the 2019 timeline, it's a little difficult to tell how it will work out because since 2019, there's not been a great deal of experience in these arbitrations, but I do believe that it's a more realistic time frame. I think the pleadings take an inordinate amount of time. I mean, I've just settled the reply in a very heavy commercial arbitration involving some power project, etc. It took me the better part of 1 month fairly concentrated to actually put in that reply because it's a massive claim and it's a complicated reply. And by the time we were able to communicate over Zoom and get the documents together, so on and so forth, and do a good job of it, it took a month. And then, of course, the client's board sometimes wants to see it and wants to cast their eye over it. And this was a very technical matter which involves all sorts of electricity regulation, so on and so forth. So there are complex matters where the pleadings do take time. So I think this is a useful exercise. Anyone who has done commercial arbitration in India will tell you the most difficult part is the evidence stage. So, but if you do the pleadings properly, you have a very good idea of the evidence. So I think that the 2019 timeframe is doable. I think we have to entirely change the way that we practice if we are going to do it. I think 2 or 3 things must take place. One, there must be certainly a more dedicated bar to arbitration. There can't be a bar where the lawyers are busy for large periods in between because the timelines are going to be very, very demanding. The other change that I think will have to be brought about is that there is going to be an oversight from the lead counsel from drafting evidence to argument, because it's very difficult to pick up the thread of evidence if you've not been involved in the draft to start with. You are in a much better position to quickly do the evidence, to meet the timelines if you've already done the drafting. So I think it is doable. I think it will still be a strain, if you ask me personally, knowing what we do of the arbitration process. And of course, a word on the arbitrators is not to criticize them, but many of them are elderly. Many of them are not used to working actively very, very long hours. It's a different thing to be listening passively and to be controlling the arbitration actively. That's a very different point and a very different experience. They go to sleep from the last direction and pick it up when we appear next before them. Whereas arbitrators in international arbitrations, as all of you know, are constantly on the email saying this has to be done, that has to be done, this has not come, that has not come. So I think that all of us, me included, would have to really pull up our socks to actually do a testing matter within this timeline. But I think it's possible. I think also the courts should be more disciplined in the extensions that they grant. Sufficient cause is more or less viewed as any stateable cause at this point of time. I think that's also got to change. It will put a big strain on the arbitration system in India. But if we are to claw back a reputation which is, may I say, somewhat squandered at present, in international eyes at least, I think it is very, very essential. If we are to get back the confidence of our clients, which, if I may also say, is somewhat shaken as a result of the developments that have taken place in arbitration, I think we're going to have to change things here. If we want to prevent big arbitration from going abroad, I think we are going to have to make this timeline work. Today in the morning, I had a conference where my clients told me that we have to have this arbitration sorted out in 45 days. And what he said is we have to have it because our investor has said that this money will come in only when we have a result on this. The arbitration is not even started. My advice to him, unfortunately, was take your arbitration abroad because it can't be done here. It's just not possible. It's not going to have it. And therefore, I have suggested a SIAC arbitration for them. I've also made some other suggestions. But the point is, when it came to arbitration, our system is not in a position to deliver quickly. Now, 45 days was an unrealistic time frame I would say, in any system. But the point is that even if it was not 45 days and it was 90 days or it was 180 days, if we really had to have a result and it was critical, I would have said our system cannot deliver. So I think that's got to change. I think that the timelines have sensitized people to the need for change. I think they've sensitized the arbitrators to the fact that their actions will also be scrutinized by courts, which I think is a good thing, because I think it was too much of a carte blanche with regard to time that was going on outside of the courts. So on the whole, I think that we are moving in the right direction. My current experience is that it is having an effect, but it's a slow moving process. As we go ahead, hopefully, it will seep more into the system, and all of us will decline an arbitration if we can't meet the timeline.
Agreed, Zal. And I think speaking of timelines, we are also woefully running behind timelines. And so what we do, no, Zal, nothing to do with you. In fact, I'm trying to claw back my reputation as a moderator to be able to manage the time. But I think what we'll do is we'll quickly perhaps skip a couple of discussion points that we had and move straight to arbitral awards. And I think one common question that is often asked is when it comes to a decree, it's quite straightforward. CPC tells you how to go about filing a challenge, etc. But what about an arbitral award? Gaurav, can you throw some light on what recourse is available to a party in the case of an arbitral award? If one is to challenge arbitral award, what is the recourse that is available? Is it the same as a decree, or are there some deviations or variations?
Your question is relating to recourse to challenge an arbitral award or to enforce an arbitral award?
Challenge to an arbitral award. Challenge to an.
So recourse to challenge to an arbitral award. So there are two, whether it's a domestic arbitration or an international arbitration, or a foreign arbitration, I would say. Yeah. So if it's a domestic arbitration, your challenge is under Section 34. Within 90 days, you're really supposed to challenge the award once you receive a copy of it, with 30 days extension of time. The law earlier was that once you challenge an award, it practically amounted to an automatic stay, because the award could not be enforced as a decree if an application for challenge was pending. Now, luckily, now the Act itself has been amended. Apart from there being a bit of a change in law, the Supreme Court interpreting the law post-amendment slightly differently. Now, basically what it means is you have practically a 90-day stay period, after which if you don't obtain a stay, the award becomes enforceable. So the award is enforceable once the 90-day or 120-day period is over, after the award has been passed. Then you have to move the court for a stay of the award. Whilst granting stay, the court, if it's a monetary award, the court will put you to terms, and it could be anything between, depending of course on the facts of the case, but generally on an ad hoc basis, at least 50% of the amount you would be told to deposit or submit a guarantee, or maybe 100% depending on the facts of that case. As far as challenge is concerned, Section 34 has actually very limited grounds. But the law as it stands in India is you have numerous grounds to challenge an award. And unfortunately, the practical experience is that, and we are all guilty, all of us argue, and all our judges also hear us, that the challenge becomes in the nature of an appeal. So although an appeal is not maintainable, the lawyers, by clever drafting, include all grounds. As you know, they say this is perverse, that finding is perverse, this is against public policy. So use those that nomenclature. And courts do tend to interfere in India under 34, probably more than they should. They also come across awards often which are extraordinary, unsustainable, and they set it aside. But once you open the doors, then everybody wants to take a chance, and you have to hear everybody. You can't dismiss the petition without giving reasons. So you have to consider every argument. And as a result of which, there are tremendous delays under 34. Matters take long to reach. Even if they're admitted, it takes several years to reach. As a result of which, a party is often deprived of the fruits of his award for long periods of time. So that is the difficulty we are facing. 34 has not been strictly interpreted, and this is starting from ONGC saw pipes downwards. The interpretation is wide enough. Of course, ultimately, when the judge decides, most judges do not interfere in the arbitral award, or rarely interfere. But the point is, the parties are still to be heard, and that delays the entire process. So that is the difficulty we find insofar as the delay in the arbitral procedure in India. Even post award, there's tremendous delay. Then there is an appeal against that. And then finally parties go to Supreme Court. So the entire procedure, if someone wants to delay, can be delayed for several years. The good part of the amendment is that there is no automatic stay, and as a result of which, if you're put to terms and you are required to deposit a substantial part of the monies, matters often get settled, because a party, if he realizes that the delay does not benefit him and he's out of pocket, he might as well settle the matter. And the succeeding party also would probably realize that instead of waiting for years, he would rather take the money, whatever he gets, and finish the matter. Unfortunately, the issue really is with public sector bodies. They do not settle. They litigate and litigate and litigate till the Supreme Court. And in such cases, even though you may have succeeded against public sector bodies, getting that ultimate fruit, even if you succeed all the way, takes several years. Public sector body ends up, if it finally losing paying huge amount by way of interest, but there is little responsibility. No one is held liable for the frivolous challenge and for the payment of interest. And they also take their chances because they very often succeed, because courts do interfere. And if not setting aside the entire award, they set aside part of the award or reduce the interest, which itself is success for a person who wants to challenge it. So something has to be done here where the interference by courts is substantially reduced. We have taken one good step in the right direction by the legislative amendment, where there's no automatic stay after 3 months. But something further has to be done where we reduce the court interference and the scope and ambit of Section 34 as interpreted. Even the amendments, according to me, do not address it. They have made marginal amendments which do not really change the law, in my opinion. I mean, you interpreted and you've defined what public policy is, but still it really doesn't change much of the law. And we are still at that stage where 34 proceedings take a long time. Of course, as the problem is also basically that courts are also overburdened. They don't have the time. You don't have sufficient judges. And if a 34 petition has to be fully heard, it would take on all points, and not only on the points expressly provided in 34. It takes a long time. So that is the difficulty we are all facing in arbitral proceedings post-award in India. Therefore, enforcement can take some time. That is the problem. It's not as easy as getting an award and enforcing it the next day.
I'd like to hear from Zal and Dr. Ghemawat also on this, but just before that, what we'll do is, subject to the permission of all the panelists, we'll just extend the time period by 10 minutes, if that's all right. And we'll conclude with, Zal, your thoughts, Dr. Ghemawat, your thoughts on judicial interference when it comes to arbitral awards, because there seems to be a varied thought process on this. You have one school of thought which favor intervention for various reasons, and then there is another one who are completely against it. So I'm happy to hear, I'd like to hear Zal from you on this, and then we'll come to Dr. Ghemawat, and maybe Raj, you can also share your thoughts.
Would you like me to
Zal.
go next? Yeah, okay.
Zal, go ahead.
Well, I think it returns actually to what I said first, is that there has been a lot of uncertainty in the law governing challenges in India as well. And the uncertainty is not restricted only to the high courts. It has been in several judgments of the Supreme Courts as well. I think just in the short time that I have, the chief causes of uncertainty have been the ONGC saw pipes judgment, which has then been followed by the Western Gecko judgment. The clawback has come from several of the judgments of Justice Nariman, which we have seen of late, where he has tightened the contours of the challenge. What should we do about it? I think the first thing that we should do about it is to make sure that our already overburdened systems in the high courts and the district courts, which hear the challenges, maintain a discipline not to go into the merits of the matter. It's really quite simple, actually. The challenge has to be on aspects set out in 34 on not of the merits. It's a matter of judicial discipline that the judge is able to stop the counsel and say, this is an aspect on merits, I won't go into it. I, for one, don't see why the judge wouldn't do that. It will make his life easier. It will shorten the length of the hearing. It will make his judgment a lot easier. And to my mind, it will clarify the entire challenge process very considerably if they just stay off the merits of the case. Now, easier said than done, of course, because, well, the challenges go to a range of judges. They go to our very good judges in the High Court, but they also go to district judges. Now, the training that the district judge has in commercial arbitration matters may be marginal compared to that of a Bombay High Court. So we've got to view it in a realistic context also. The countervailing factor which we've got to think of also is that arbitration in our country is a mixed bag. We get some very good arbitrators, we get some very poor arbitrators. So sometimes the judge's conscience doesn't allow the arbitral award to stand. And as we all know, hard facts always make bad law. So I think these are things that can be controlled by the judges. I think that we should, as members of the bar, try as far as possible to control ourselves also for the process and for our own self-interest. It should be restricted only to narrow challenges. The system can function. It gives clarity. It gives swiftness to the system, which is otherwise lost. So in my respect, I would suggest that it's a matter really of rethinking our approach to the 34th.
Absolutely. Dr. Ghemawat?
Well, I completely agree with Jail's view on this, but let me say that ultimately you need some checks and balances. You cannot allow arbitration to go arbitrary. So Section 34 is required. But the experience suggests so far, last 2 decades, and as rightly pointed out by Zail also, ONGC Sopipes case onwards, it's a complete zigzag manner. At times broader interpretation, at times narrower interpretation, and it's all experimentation on a day-to-day basis as far as Section 34 is concerned. Now, just to give you example, in UK traditionally they were using narrow interpretation. Why can't we do this? Why can't we define it so well? In China, for example, there is no multiple challenges as far as awards are concerned. Only Supreme Court you can challenge that. So you can reduce that, lesser level of interpretation by the courts also. One more thing which appears to me very disturbing. You can't allow Article 142, invocation of Article 142 in commercial disputes, and that to an arbitration. I think that would be a completely wrong precedent to set. For example, if one judgment you say in one para that no, you cannot go into the merits of the case, because then that would be against the ethos of Section 34. But in the subsequent para, set aside the majority award and then you uphold the minority award. Then, so without going into the merits of the case, you have upheld the minority award. So the point here, what I want to mention is that Article 142 should also not be invoked like this, because you don't know how the lower courts would be interpreting this. And I think this is what I think checks and balances we need to maintain.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time.
Can I just add 2 points here?
Of course, Gaurav.
Yeah. I think some legislative interference and clarity is required. They amended it, but it's not sufficiently amended. To what extent you should permit interference, and if you would like judicial scrutiny and oversight over awards, which is a point of view, which is a quite plausible point of view, and which probably considering some of the awards would be something which would be necessary, then it's necessary that the executive provides enough infrastructure and enough judges who have the time to take up these matters. Otherwise, the entire purpose of having time limits for finishing arbitration, everything is lost if you're going to take 5 and 10 years in various courts running around trying to enforce the awards. So that would make the system very ineffective. That's one aspect. The second thing is a point which I have, and which I have always thought would speed up the 34 petitions, even though the law may be what it is now, is that if you provide that a judge who hears a 34 petition and wants to dismiss it does not have to give reasons. The moment he doesn't have to give reasons, the matter would go much faster and can be disposed of faster. Only if he wants to set aside the award, or he wants to alter or modify it to the extent he is permissible, would he be required to give reasons? That would really speed up matters. But it's something which the legislature has not accepted. I had talked to Justice Sri Krishna also when he was part of the committee. I don't think it found favor with them, but I think that would really speed it up. If you're not required to give reasons, then it's very easy for judges to say, I don't see any reason to interfere, and dismiss it. Because the reasons are to be found in the award itself.
True. Thank you so much for that. And I think I did promise to open up the webinar to questions from the audience, and I have received some questions. But what I will do is, in the interest of time, I think we'll respond to the audience members offline, if that's okay. Raj, do you have some closing comments, remarks, some key takeaways from this very, very insightful and informative discussion?
Sure, Kinshuk. Thank you. I think you've done a great thing by moderating this and trying to keep us all on check. Some of the key takeaways that I see is to start from drafting of the arbitration clauses, that you need to be clear in what you want from your arbitration clause, which disputes you want to go for, to take it to arbitration. Ensure proper selection of seat, jurisdiction. So these are some of the key points that you need to keep in mind while you are drafting the arbitration clause. When we move to say the timelines, I think the three key takeaways that I see from the timeline perspective is that while timeline has helped in certain extent, in a larger complicated matters timeline, we need an extended timeline. And I think if we go to court with an extension in a complicated matters, I think courts have by and large agreeable to give timelines, but court can probably put some kind of more checks and balances there to see whether the timelines are actually required or not required, the additional time is required or not. Because in some sense, I think that timelines have brought certain kinds of arbitrations in place. That in India, we may have large arbitrations and also smaller arbitrations. And I think smaller arbitrations which were there, they started to come to terms within a period of 12 to 18 months. But the larger ones, as Zal really mentioned, and the experience that he just shared with us about a complicated power dispute, would require a longer timeline. And there, the courts can use a discretion in granting the timeline, keeping in mind the facts. I think that's another takeaway. Regarding interim reliefs, I think Gaurav rightly pointed out that going to court under Section 9 prior to the commencement of the arbitration is easy to do because it's a quick fix. But during the pendency of the arbitration, it's always difficult to go to court and say that we want an interim relief unless you are able to establish, as Gaurav said, that you need a receiver to be appointed, a court receiver to be appointed, because in an arbitration you can only get a private receiver. So that's again a very important issue. When you need a third party and an order against a third party, again you may need to go to court, while the tribunal is now empowered to grant it, but whether the party will actually follow it or not, while there is a provision for contempt now for non-following the tribunal's orders, but still that has not so far been tested as much. So I would say that's again a very important topic. And again, yes, against 34 in challenges to the award, I think the arbitration in India has got a bad name for its delay processes that it is. But there's also one fact that we should know, that in the last few years after the timelines that have come in, I feel that arbitrations have relatively started to get completed faster as compared to what used to happen earlier. But we do get stuck in courts. As soon as we complete an arbitration, say even in 18 months, the next that you get stuck is in courts. Now, unless we are putting 100% deposits in court and parties are made to put those 100% deposits in court, the arbitration keeps 34 will go, continue to go. After 34, you have 37, then you go to Supreme Court. So somewhere there has to be a checks and balance whether we need X number of appeals. Because even if you have an award, you can't enforce it till probably next 10 years, which is not what was intended for.
Right.
These are some of the key takeaways that I think that we've got from the panelists today, and we need to try and see what we can all, as the stakeholders in the arbitration, can do.
Absolutely, Raj. Thank you so much for that. And once again, Zal, Gaurav, Dr. Ghemawat, thank you so much for taking time out from your very, very busy schedule. I know Zal and Gaurav, you have to run for a hearing. So really appreciate it. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. For the audience, we have a very brief poll that is going to show up on your screen very shortly. Just request you to answer the few questions purely from a feedback perspective. This will only help us organize the webinar better the next time. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care, stay safe.